Dave Corinth here. Welcome to my shop. Today I'm going to turn this Stanley No. 40 scrub plane body, which has seen better days, into a usable, workable plane using these parts. I picked up this Stanley No. 40 scrub plane body from Michael Jinks at Just Plain Fun, and it's missing pretty much everything that you would need to make it a usable plane. It doesn't have a knob or a tote. It doesn't have an iron or a screw cap. So what we're going to do is we're going to make all those parts from these parts. So this will become the knob. This will become the tote. I have a piece of 01 tool steel for the iron. And I have some bronze for the lever cap, screw cap. And of course, a stainless steel set screw. So let's get started. So what is a scrub plane? Well, a scrub plane is a plane that removes a lot of material quickly to take it down to thickness. So this one is a dedicated scrub plane, meaning that Stanley made it for that specific purpose. It is extremely simple. All you have is a knob, a tote, an iron, and a screw cap, and that is it. And it has a very large opening on the mouth, so it can let large chips pass through. A lot of people will convert jack planes or junk smooth planes into scrub planes. This is my Stanley No. 5 Type 4 that I have used for years as a light scrub plane. It only has an 8-inch radius versus the 3-inch radius on a scrub plane iron. This is the pattern that I use to make irons for the scrub plane. We are going to use this piece of 01 tool steel to make the iron for this. It's 1/8 of an inch thick and 1 1/4 inches wide. We're going to use these old bronze fittings to cast a new cap based on the old Stanley pattern. We're going to use this piece of Honduras mahogany to make the knob. And we're going to use this piece of Honduras mahogany to make the tote. Next thing I want to do is disassemble this plane, and there's not much to it. We have the back rod, the front rod, which I know will not come off right now because it is in there well, and then we have to get this out. And this is actually not a friction fit pin. It's actually threaded, and if you look right there, you can see the slot for the screw. Before I even attempt to take that thing out, I'm going to throw some flukum juice on it. And I'll let this sit for a while before I try to break that loose. And as you can see here, once I get the vice grips on that threaded rod, I'll start working it back and forth in little increments. I don't want to try to break that threaded rod loose all at once. I found this method works the best for old rods and screws that don't want to come out. And since I'm going to save this pinch pin, I protect it from the vice grips with a piece of leather. And then I repeat the same process, working it back and forth until it breaks loose. Now this has a lot of crud built up on it, so to drive it through the other hole on the other side, I need to clean it off first. So I'll spin it with a screwdriver to make sure it's free from the threads, and then I'll use a punch to push that pinch rod all the way through. Now the body on this one's pretty rough. If the Japanning was in a lot better condition, I wouldn't worry about refinishing it, but this one's pretty rough. So I'm going to go ahead and media blast it and get all that old Japanning off there. And media blasting or sandblasting, in my opinion, is by far the fastest and most effective way to get rid of that old Japanning and rust. Now to protect the threaded holes, I put old frog screws in there because they have the same pitch. And to protect those threads on the side, I put the original pinch pin back in until it's flush on the inside. And for the finish on these, I use Ford Semi-Gloss Black Duplicolor engine paint. And I build that finish up with about 5 coats, making sure to apply each finish within 30 minutes of the other. So I let the paint dry overnight, and you can see that it is extremely shiny. Even though that's semi-gloss paint, this is how they pretty much always come out. But they don't stay like that. The longer it sits, the harder it gets. And when it sits for about 2 days, you can take Johnson's paste wax or any kind of paste wax, go over the whole thing, and then buff that in with a cotton rag, and it will actually dull this finish just a little bit, just enough to where it looks more like authentic Japanning instead of a plain body that's been rattle canned. I also cleaned up the cross pin or pinch pin, and you can see that the result is about what you would expect for a plane that's 120, 130, 140 years old. So this goes in from this direction, and it's so clean now that I don't even have to have the screwdriver to install it. I can just thread it in like that, and it's all the way in. There's no point in really tightening that down too much. I mean, you can put it a little snug, but there's no point in cranking it down. It's not going to go anywhere. So the next thing I want to do is I want to make the tote and the knob. So this is what we're going to make the tote out of. This is a piece of Honduras mahogany. It's a little less than an inch thick, about 15/16. We're going to make an original shaped tote out of that. And to do that, I'm going to use this template right here. Then we'll trace it. And then cut that shape out on the bandsaw. Then attach this template to it. Take it over to my router, route the edges, and then we'll put it into my tote drilling jig, and then do some final finish on it. It'll be ready to go. The knob I'm going to make out of this piece of Honduras mahogany. This came from an old upright grand piano that somebody was going to throw away. It was in really bad shape, so I didn't feel bad about taking it apart. But if you ever want to find a good source of old wood, find an old upright grand piano and take one apart. There is a lot of old wood in an upright grand piano. And of course, this one is 2 pieces. I don't need this piece. I need this center piece. It's just big enough to make this knob out of. So all I want to do is take chisel and go ahead and pop that piece off. Like so. Yeah, didn't come off all the way there. But we'll get all that off before we turn this. So it's kind of odd shape, but it shouldn't be bad. Once I get this centered and get that centered, there's enough meat here to make this knob. The Honduras mahogany that I'm using for this tote came from Gibson guitar. So it's kind of funny that the knob will be from a piano and the tote will be from a guitar. And once I get the basic shape cut out on the bandsaw, I attach this template onto the tote, and it's ready to go into the router. And you want to keep your fingers away from that bit. That bit is scary. That's why it has that handle on there. So with the template off, this is what you end up with. And this is the exact same profile as the original. And it does both sides at once, so you don't have to do one side, then flip it over and do the other. So I love that router bit from Lee Valley, especially for making totes and saw handles. Next thing I want to do is I have to take this template and then transfer the actual size of it onto this to get the top and the bottom. And it takes a little bit of finagling to get it right where you want it, which is about right, whoops, about right there. And then all you have to do is take a pencil, transfer the top and the bottom, and then take this over to a bandsaw, cut that out, cut this off, and then do a little bit of sanding, and then we'll put it in our tote drilling jig, we'll be a step closer. So after I got the top and the bottom sanded, I went ahead and transferred all the markings that are necessary to drill the holes on this. This rod angle on the 40s is anywhere from 28 to 30. This one ended up being 28, so that's what we're going to go with. You can see here's where it will come out the bottom. This is for the little nib that sits right here, and this is for the top barrel nut. So to drill these holes, I put it in my tote making jig, which apparently right now is too tight, so I got to loosen everything up. There we go. Still too tight. Aha! So all I do is set it in this jig, tighten the set screws down, and then make sure there's no gap between this angle block and the bottom and the top. And you can see this angle block is set at 28 degrees, and it allows me to drill that hole straight up and down instead of having to angle it on my drill press. So let's go drill these holes. I'm not showing all the details that go along with this tote making jig because I made a separate video on that, so you can catch the process of making the jig and of course the process of making a tote with this jig. So for now I'm just showing you the basics of it, but I am going to make a video on making a tote for a 40.5. I have some special wood that I want to use to make the tote for my 40.5. In a previous video I called this file a fret file, and I was wrong. It's actually just a Luthier's file, so I want to go ahead and make that correction now. But either way, it's a fantastic file. You can get these from Stuart McDonald, and they are great for rounding these corners on totes. To do the final shaping of the tote, I use this little drum sander that I picked up from Lee Valley, and I'm using 220 grit sandpaper. Mahogany's soft enough that it doesn't take much to sand these down. But it allows me to make sure that the edges of the tote are not flat, like the originals. And to finish them up, I do the last bit of sanding by hand. And I try to go with the grain when I can, so you don't see sanding marks on it. And the last step before I start putting stain on these is to take this countersink and hit each hole. This compensates for the fillets that are on the plain casting. And of course I want to make sure this tote fits like it should, so I'm going to go ahead and test fit it and make sure everything's lined up. And now on to the knob. If you'll remember, this piece of mahogany that I'm using to make the knob came from an old upright grand piano. And I believe it was made around 1900. And for some reason, and I'm sure there's a correlation between the two, but every time I turn old mahogany like this, it smells like an old book. And I don't have a CNC to make these or any kind of preset pattern. I make each one at a time. And I've made so many of them that it's almost muscle memory. And it doesn't take long to whip one of these things out, about 10 or 15 minutes. One of the interesting things about these early scrub planes is they have a very unique knob shape. The bottom has what's called a fast taper. At least that's what I've heard it called. And it's the only time I've ever seen Stanley do this on any of their planes. When I drill the holes for the knob, I have a plate that I sit in my vise, and you can see it there, but it helps me line all the holes up just right. And I drill the one from the top and finish it off at the bottom. I don't drill them all the way through in one pass. And of course, just like the tote, I'm going to test fit the knob to make sure it fits like I want it. Since the wood for the knob is probably 100 years older than the wood that's on the tote, they aren't the same color. So I'm going to stain these so that they're closer to the same color. And I have a special blend of stain that I use, which is a 50-50 mix of Minwax Red Mahogany and Minwax Special Walnut. And once I've let that stain soak into the mahogany for about 10 or 15 minutes, I wipe it down with a rag and let them sit for another good 2 or 3 hours before I apply any finish. Last night before I left the shop, I went ahead and put 3 coats of lacquer on the tote and the knob, and they've had a chance to dry overnight. But before I polish them up, I like to let these sit a good 24 to 48 hours, let that lacquer really harden. So in the meantime, I want to go ahead and make the screw cap. And to make the screw cap, we're going to use these pieces of bronze, this pattern, and we're going to sand cast it and make a brand new screw cap. And if you're wondering why it takes this much bronze to make one screw cap, well, it's because I make 4 of them at a time. This is the pattern that I use for all the Stanley No. 40 caps. And I made this from a piece of cherry, and it's based off of an original. Only it's thicker. And since it's bronze, it won't crack if you apply pressure, which is a common occurrence on these original Stanley caps. But casting one at a time doesn't make much sense because that would take forever. So I took this, made an epoxy copy, and then glued 4 of them to this piece of plywood, and therefore I can cast 4 at a time. And through the magic of video editing, you can see I already have the cope and the drag filled with sand, and this is an exact negative of the pattern. Now all we have to do is attach the cope to the drag, like so. We'll put some screws in here and pour some hot molten bronze down that hole, and we'll have 4 caps ready to machine. I am by no means an expert at casting brass or bronze, but I learn something new every time I do it, and I build from those mistakes. And in this case, I did make a mistake. A small one, but it was a mistake nonetheless. When I started to pour the bronze into the sand mold, I stopped a little bit and then restarted. You never want to do that. Once this cooled for about an hour, I took the cope and the drag apart. And the top 2 turned out great, and the bottom 2, not so much. They won't be usable, and that's because I stopped and started. So those won't be able to be used, and of course I'll use this as a learning experience and make sure I don't do it again. But I did get 2 really good castings out of this pour. Once I've cut the caps off of the tree, the next thing I want to do is machine the bottom flat. And I do this on my vertical mill. This face mill makes quick work of getting these caps flat on the bottom. And I end up taking about a 32nd of an inch off. And next I want to drill and tap for the 1032 stainless steel set screw. Before I polish the cap up, I like to make sure they fit just right. So I'm going to take the iron blank, set it in place, and then tighten down the screw cap. And what I'm looking for is the gap between the screw cap and the iron, and make sure the iron's not touching the tote. When these come out of the sand mold, they've got some discoloration on it, but that's just superficial and it comes off easy. So the first thing I want to do is I want to sand those OG sides on that cap. And I do this on that same drum sander that I use for the totes with 220 grit sandpaper. And to sand the flat spots, I use this little 1-inch disc sander with 240 grit sandpaper. And to dress up the seat for the pinch pin, I actually use this chainsaw file that I spin in my drill press. It makes quick work and it comes out very smooth. I don't polish the leading edge of these caps. I actually leave a brushed finish on there. So I put some tape on it to protect it when I go over to my sanding center. This is 120 grit, and all I'm doing is just curving that leading edge. And this will get polished up with 220 grit later. To clean all the sanding marks from the disc sander, I use these little profile sanders with 220 grit sandpaper on there and clean it up. I also do a lot of this work by hand. It really gets in those tight corners. But it's really important before you polish it that you get all those sanding marks off there. And it doesn't take long with a little bit of rouge on this buffing pad to polish that cap up. I retape the cap, and then I'm going to go ahead and sand by hand that leading edge. And then I'm going to take some red Scotch-Brite and brush it up. After I lap the back of the cap on a plate, I then take it over to the same piece of red Scotch-Brite and polish the back up. Next, I want to turn my attention to the iron. And the first thing I'm going to do is cut these dog ears off the top. And these are cut off at about 12 degrees. And you could do this on a grinder, but I just do it with my end mill because I get the exact same result every time. Once I do one side, I flip it over and do the other. The profile on the Stanley scrub plane has a 3-inch radius. So here I'm just going to do this by hand and get as close as I can to that 3-inch radius. I'm not worried about generating heat because it's not been heat treated yet. And before it goes to heat treat, I'm going to go ahead and remove about 75% of that primary bevel. It'll make it a lot easier when I do go to make the bevel, as I won't have to remove as much material after it's been hardened. And once I get the iron all profiled like I want it, I want to go ahead and do one more test fit just to be safe, especially now that the screw cap is polished. And now that I know everything fits like it should, I'm going to go ahead and send this iron off to get heat treated. So in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and polish the knob and the tote. The lacquer on the knob and the tote have had sufficient time to harden. So now I can hit it with some 4/0 steel wool. I would like to take a second to point out that now I have 2 cans of Johnson's Paste Wax. This is the one I've had for quite a while, and as you can see, it's just about empty. But thanks to a subscriber, Pat Walls, he sent me a full can of unused Johnson's Paste Wax, and I cannot thank him enough. Thank you very much. And after I go over the tote and knob with that 4/0 steel wool, I'm going to take some of that Johnson's Paste Wax and go over each one thoroughly. And I'm going to let that dry for about 15 minutes. And in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and file the seat for the iron. The seat for the iron originally wasn't heavily machined, so all that's necessary is just to kind of hit it with a file to make sure this new iron will seat properly. And now we can go ahead and buff this body out with some of that Johnson's paste wax and give it a more authentic look. Take some of that shine off of it. And now that the wax on the tote and knob have dried, I'm going to go ahead and buff both of those out. And when I buff the wax off of the body, I'm going to get a little rough with it. I don't mind if I see minute scratches here and there. It's a 100-and-something-year-old plane, so having a scratch here and there won't hurt a thing. The barrel nuts for the tote and knob have a few nicks and scratches here and there, and it's mostly from someone using the wrong size screwdriver to take them off. So I'm going to go ahead and clean those up. And all I'm trying to do here is remove those tiny little nicks on the end from the screwdrivers. And once I'm done, I'm going to polish it with some 4/0 steel wool. Not really polish it, but just kind of smooth it out a little bit. And once that's done, I'm going to go ahead and attach the tote and the knob for the last time. And now it's time to do the funnest part, and that is flattening the sole. Now on a scrub plane, it's not super important that the sole be super flat. So really all I'm trying to do is just kind of knock it down. I'm not going to sit here and make sure this thing's down to the nearest 15 thousandths of an inch. And now that the iron's back from heat treat, I can go ahead and finish that primary bevel. And you can see now that it's hardened, it is throwing some sparks. And here, of course, I want to watch out and make sure I don't get it hot, so I'm constantly dunking it in water to cool it down. When I get these back from heat treat, the irons are really discolored, and they're kind of a dark gray color. And I want it to look more like freshly ground steel. So to do that, all I'm going to do is clean it up with some WD-40 and some 220 grit sandpaper. And you don't want to forget to hit those edges. The first step to sharpening any iron is, of course, to make sure the back of the iron is dead flat. And you want to remove those grinding marks. And I do this on my diamond stones. And because this is a scrub plane, the iron doesn't have to be super sharp like that of a smoother joiner. It doesn't produce a finished edge, and it leaves a pretty rough shaving. So all I'm going to do is kind of hit it with a 3000 grit water stone. Make sure it's sharp enough to do the job, but it doesn't need to be sharpened like a smooth plane. And you can see I'm constantly turning that iron as I'm drawing it across the water stone to match the profile. And I'm not doing it in the same spot every time. I'm moving that iron around so I don't make a dip in my water stone. And once the iron is sharpened, I take the iron over some red Scotch-Brite. This really polishes that iron up and gives it a nice smooth finish. And you want to make sure you hit those edges. Just make sure you don't hit your freshly honed or lapped surfaces with that Scotch-Brite. And while sharpening a scrub plane iron to this level is probably an overkill, it's always nice to know that all of your planes are sharpened and ready to go, even a scrub plane. And now it's time to put this thing together. And there's not much to it, just an iron and a screw cap. Tighten the screw cap and you're ready to go. And the screw cap on these scrub planes doesn't need to be tightened much, just enough to keep it in place, which is why you often see those original caps broken from over tightening. And the best part about fixing up any old hand plane is actually getting to use it for the first time. Going diagonally across the grain on this piece of old black walnut, you can see that scrub plane removes that stock quickly. Well, I hope this video was helpful if you decide to restore an old scrub plane. Comment, like, and subscribe, and I'll make more. Thank you for watching.